Hey guys, before we start, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any feedback. Let's go to the story. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, over years, disguised as small disappointments and overlooked moments. You tell yourself it doesn't matter, that you're imagining things, that love isn't measured in grand gestures but in the everyday, quiet sacrifices. And then one day, you see things clearly. I spent over 2 decades raising a daughter who wasn't mine by blood but was, without a doubt, my daughter in every way that counted. I met my wife, Laura, when her little girl, Sophie, was 5 years old. At the time, her biological father, Jason, was nothing more than a ghost, drifting in and out of her life with grand promises and little follow-through. Sophie was the kind of kid who trusted easily. No matter how many times Jason let her down, she always greeted him with wide eyes and excitement, clinging to the hope that this time would be different. It never was. I never tried to replace him. I never spoke badly about him. But I was the one who showed up. I was there for every school play, every scraped knee, and every late-night fever. I taught her how to ride a bike, sat through endless piano recitals, and helped her navigate the kind of heartbreak that only teenage years can bring. She called me Dad long before it was official. It was one of the greatest honors of my life. And then came the wedding. When Sophie got engaged, I was thrilled for her. She had found someone who seemed like a good man, and I couldn't wait to walk her down the aisle. In my mind, it wasn't even a question. Then, the invitation arrived. It was formal, impersonal. My name was listed, but only as a guest. Nothing about the role I had played in her life. Nothing about the father I had been to her. And when I asked about it, carefully, because I didn't want to assume, she gave me a look of mild confusion, as if she didn't even understand the question. Jason is my biological father. I've always wanted him to walk me down the aisle. There was no hesitation in her voice. No awareness of what she had just done. 2 decades of love, commitment, and sacrifice, all reduced to a biological technicality. I stood there, speechless. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for recognition. I simply nodded, congratulated her again, and left. The wedding day was, without exaggeration, one of the most humiliating days of my life. I arrived early, sat quietly among the other guests, and watched as the man who had abandoned her more times than I could count walked her down the aisle. He was beaming, soaking in the attention, acting like he had earned that moment. During the reception, I waited, hoped, even, that someone would acknowledge me. A speech, a toast, even a passing mention. Nothing. I was invisible. I stayed for a few hours, long enough to fulfill my obligation, then left before the night ended. No one noticed. No one stopped me. That was the moment I knew. I had spent 20 years pouring love into someone who had never truly seen me as her father. It didn't even hurt the way I expected it to. It just felt empty. A part of me that had always been willing to give without hesitation shut down that night. And I didn't know it yet, but that was just the beginning. The week after the wedding, I kept to myself. I told myself it was just exhaustion, that I needed time to process everything. But the truth was simpler than that. I was done. I didn't have the energy to pretend anymore, to force smiles, to pretend I wasn't hurt, to keep playing the role of the reliable father figure when it was clear that I had never truly been seen that way. I avoided calls, ignored texts, and threw myself into work. I needed distance. Then Sophie returned from her honeymoon. I wasn't expecting much from her. A thank you for attending, maybe a polite check-in. Instead, she called me, sounding cheerful, like nothing had happened. She gushed about the beaches, the resort, the candlelit dinner her husband, Ryan, had surprised her with. I listened in silence, nodding along, giving short, non-committal responses. Then, the real reason for her call became clear. Dad, she said, her voice slipping into that familiar, affectionate tone. The same one she used whenever she wanted something. I need a favor. I didn't say anything. There were some unexpected expenses on the honeymoon, she continued, and we're a little short on cash. Could you cover it? Just until we get things sorted out. I let the words sink in. She hadn't spoken to me since before the wedding. Hadn't checked in, hadn't even acknowledged what she had done. And now, the first thing out of her mouth wasn't an apology. It was a request for money. I took a slow breath, keeping my voice steady even as my hands clenched into fists. I'm sorry, Sophie. I can't help you this time. Silence. I could picture the confusion on her face, the disbelief. But you've always helped before. I had. Every time. Without question. Without hesitation. Not this time. Maybe you should ask Jason, I said evenly. He's your real father, isn't he? Maybe he can help. Another long silence. Then, a quiet, I understand. And just like that, she hung up. No argument. No anger. No further explanation. Just an abrupt ending that left a hollow space in my chest. Later that evening, my wife, Laura, confronted me. Why would you say that to her? She demanded, arms crossed, disappointment written all over her face. I exhaled sharply, setting down my coffee. Are we doing this, Laura? She needed help, she pressed. And you just shut her out. I didn't shut her out, I said calmly. She did that the moment she chose Jason over me. You were there. You saw what happened. That was her wedding, not her whole life. Then why am I only her father when she needs money? Laura flinched at that. I continued, voice low but firm. I was there for her for 20 years, Laura. And when it mattered, she made it clear that I wasn't enough. So now? Now, I'm doing the same. She stared at me for a long moment. I could see the wheels turning, the emotion she was trying to process. This isn't about money, I added. It's about respect. I was there for her when Jason wasn't, but when she had the chance to acknowledge that, she chose to act like it never happened. I can't keep being her backup plan whenever things don't go her way. Laura shook her head, her jaw tightening. She's still your daughter. No, Laura, I said quietly. She's Jason's daughter. And she made sure the whole world knew that. The conversation ended in silence. Something between us shifted that night, something neither of us wanted to say out loud just yet. I didn't know it then, but that silence was the beginning of the end. The days stretched into weeks, and Sophie didn't call again. I thought it would hurt more than it did. The first few nights, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for some wave of regret to hit me. But it never came. What I felt instead was relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. No more phone calls that started with small talk and ended with a request for money. No more being the safety net for a daughter who had made it clear I wasn't enough when it mattered. Laura, however, wasn't ready to let it go. She wasn't outright hostile, but I could feel the shift in her. She moved differently around me, spoke more carefully, like she was afraid of setting something off. At first, she kept trying to reason with me, dropping little comments over dinner, hoping I'd crack. She's struggling, you know. I don't think she realized how tight money would be after the wedding. Ryan is doing his best, but things aren't easy. Maybe we could just help them one last time. I know you're upset, but is this really worth ruining your relationship over? I let her words roll off me, keeping my answers short. She made her choice. She's an adult. She'll figure it out. This isn't my problem anymore. And that was the truth. I had spent 20 years making sure she never had to struggle. She had no problem choosing Jason when it was convenient. Now, she could see how far that got her. Then, about a month after the wedding, Laura sat across from me at the dinner table, pushing her food around her plate, before finally exhaling and saying what had been weighing on her mind. Andrew lost his job. I barely blinked. They're behind on rent, she continued, watching my face closely. If they don't pay in 2 weeks, they're getting evicted. I nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. I had already seen this coming. Don't you think we should help? I set my fork down carefully and looked her in the eye. No. Laura let out a sharp breath, frustration flashing across her face. Seriously? You're just going to let them be homeless? They're not homeless. They have options. Like what? Like asking Jason. She scoffed. Oh, come on. You know he's useless. I do, I agreed. And yet, he was still the one she chose to walk her down the aisle. Funny how that works. Laura's mouth pressed into a thin line. This isn't about Jason, she tried. This is about her. About doing what's right. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. Tell me something, Laura. If Sophie had chosen me that day, if she had acknowledged everything I'd done for her, would Jason be here right now? Would she be going to him for help instead of me? Laura hesitated. That pause told me everything. I shook my head. Exactly. I was never her father. Not when it mattered. I was just the guy who handled problems when no one else would. And I'm done being that person. So you're punishing her? No. I'm letting her live with the choices she made. Laura pushed her chair back abruptly, grabbed her plate, and stormed to the sink. I watched as she scrubbed at it furiously, her shoulders tense. That night, we slept with our backs turned to each other. It was the beginning of a new kind of silence. Sophie didn't reach out to me directly. But a week later, I got a message from Ryan. Hey, it's Ryan. I need to talk to you about something important. Do you have time? I stared at my phone for a long time, knowing exactly what this was about. It was always about money. I didn't reply right away. I let the message sit there, untouched, for a full day before finally deciding. I agreed to meet him, not because I was going to help, but because I wanted to see if he had the guts to say it to my face. I met Ryan at a small cafe near my office. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table, nervously tapping his fingers against an untouched cup of coffee. The moment he saw me, he sat up straighter, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Hey, thanks for meeting me." I didn't respond right away. I just took my seat, watching him, waiting. Ryan wasn't a bad guy. A little naive, maybe. He had always seemed polite, eager to impress, but right now, there was something different about him. A stiffness in his shoulders, a hesitation in his voice. He was desperate. I already knew what he was going to ask. Still, I let him talk. "I know things have been tense between you and Sophie," he started, "but we're in a really tough spot. I lost my job recently, and my rent's overdue. If we don't come up with the money in 2 weeks, we'll be evicted." I nodded slowly, waiting to see if he would say anything else. He didn't. "How much do you need?" I asked, not because I intended to give it to him, but because I wanted to hear him say it. His shoulders sagged with relief, mistaking my question for a sign that I was going to agree. 2 months' rent. About $4,000. That would give us some breathing room until I find something new. For $1,000. The number hung in the air between us. I took a sip of my coffee before setting it down. "Have you asked Jason?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard. "Jason?" "Yeah," I said, tilting my head. "You know, Sophie's real father. The one she chose to give her big moment to. The one she wanted front and center in her life. Have you asked him?" Ryan looked away, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, no, but Sophie thought maybe you could help. You've always been there for her." I let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "Exactly." Ryan looked at me, clearly confused. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I was always there for her. For 20 years, I showed up. And when it really mattered, she made it clear that didn't count for anything. Now, when she needs something, I'm suddenly her father again. "No, I don't think so." Ryan opened his mouth and then shut it again. He wasn't expecting this. He thought this was going to be like every other time. "Look," he said finally, lowering his voice. "I get that you're upset. But this isn't just about Sophie. It's about me too. It's about our home, our future." I nodded. "It is. Which is why you should be handling it." His jaw tightened. "I'm trying. I just need time. And that's exactly what you should be focused on. Fixing it yourself. Because if you're coming to me, then that means Sophie didn't even bother asking Jason. And if her own father won't step up, why should I?" Ryan had no answer for that. I stood up, grabbing my coat. "This conversation is over," I said firmly. "I wish you both the best, but I'm done solving Sophie's problems." He didn't try to stop me. I walked out of that cafe without looking back. And for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Later that evening, Laura was waiting for me when I got home. The moment I walked through the door, I knew she already knew what had happened. "You met with Ryan." It wasn't a question. I set my keys down. I did. And I told him no. Her eyes flashed with something unreadable. "So you're doing this. You're cutting her off." "She cut me off first," I said simply. "I'm just following her lead." Laura shook her head, crossing her arms. "You're being cruel." I exhaled sharply, looking at her. "Laura, for years, I was there for her. I gave, and I gave, and I gave. And she took, without ever once acknowledging what I meant to her. I don't owe her anything anymore. She's struggling. That's not my problem." Laura scoffed, looking at me like I was a stranger. "I don't even recognize you anymore. Because for the first time, I'm putting myself first?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. That night, we slept in the same bed, but it might as well have been on opposite sides of the world. This wasn't just about Sophie anymore. It was about us. And for the first time, I started to wonder if we were past the point of saving. Laura and I barely spoke over the next few days. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from comfort or routine. It was the kind that sat heavy, pressing down on both of us. Every conversation was clipped, every glance filled with something unspoken. She had stopped trying to convince me, but I could see the way she looked at me now, like I had become someone she no longer understood. I wasn't sure if that was a bad thing. For the first time in years, I was setting boundaries. I was choosing myself over being a never-ending source of support for people who only seemed to remember me when they needed something. And that felt good. A week later, Sophie and Ryan were officially evicted. Laura sat at the dinner table, arms crossed. staring at her untouched food. They're staying with Ryan's mother now, in a 2-bedroom apartment, with 4 other people. I took a sip of my drink and nodded. I figured that was coming. Laura's eyes snapped up to mine. That's all you have to say? What do you want me to say, Laura? That I should have stepped in? That I should have saved them? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. Because if I had, this wouldn't have been the last time. It would have been one of many. You know that. Her fingers tightened around her fork. You could have helped her. So could Jason, I shot back. She flinched at that, like she hadn't considered it. Like she had conveniently ignored the fact that Sophie's biological father had vanished the moment things got hard. He's unreliable. He always has been. Then maybe she should have thought about that before she gave him my place at her wedding. Laura's face twisted in frustration, but she didn't say anything, because she knew I was right. 2 days later, Sophie finally broke her silence. Not to me. To Laura. She called, voice shaking, talking about how hard things had been. How the stress of living in a cramped apartment was ruining her marriage. How she didn't know if she had made a mistake in pushing me away. Laura listened. She comforted her. And then, without hesitation, she said, come home. I only found out later. I came home from work that night, tired, ready to grab a beer and sit in peace, only to find Laura packing up the guest room. I froze in the doorway, watching as she fluffed the pillows, smoothing out the blankets like she was preparing for a long-term guest. What are you doing? My voice was calm, but I already knew. Laura didn't even look up. Sophie and Ryan need a place to stay. They'll be here tomorrow. My chest tightened. I took a slow breath. No, they won't. That made her stop. She turned to face me, brows furrowed. They don't have anywhere else to go. They have plenty of options. Ryan's family. Friends. A father who is good enough to walk her down the aisle, but not good enough to help when she needs it. Oh my God. Will you just let that go? She snapped. That hit me harder than it should have. She didn't get it. Or worse, she didn't care. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. Laura, I'm not going to let them move in. Her lips pressed together. It's my house too. I know. And I'm telling you, if you do this, I won't be here. She blinked, as if she hadn't expected that. You're seriously saying you'd leave? Over this? It's not just this. That's everything. It's you constantly prioritizing Sophie over me. It's you expecting me to be her father when it's convenient, but telling me to let things go when it's not. Laura's shoulders tensed. I've given enough, I continued, voice low. I'm not doing it anymore. The room was too quiet. I could see the realization settle over her, that I wasn't bluffing. So that's it, she whispered. You're choosing to walk away? I shook my head. I'm choosing myself. For the first time in 20 years. Laura didn't speak to me for the rest of the night. She didn't try to argue, didn't try to guilt-trip me into changing my mind. She just sat in the living room, staring at nothing, the weight of my words settling over her like a stone. I could see it in her face. She thought I was bluffing. She thought that, like always, I'd come around. That I'd let Sophie and Ryan move in, that I'd keep being the same man who always cleaned up their messes, who always sacrificed, who always put them before himself. But she didn't understand. That man was gone. The next morning, I left early for work. I didn't say goodbye. When I came home that evening, the guest room was still empty. Laura hadn't called Sophie, hadn't told her to come. Maybe she was still thinking it over. Maybe she was testing me. I didn't ask. We moved around each other like strangers, barely speaking, and every conversation was reduced to the bare minimum. Pass the salt. Did you pay the water bill? I'll be home late tomorrow. It was like living with a roommate instead of a wife. A week passed. Then 2. Sophie and Ryan were still with Ryan's mother. They hadn't reached out to me directly, but through Laura, I knew how things were going. Not well. Ryan was still unemployed. They were burning through their savings. Their marriage was struggling under the weight of their financial problems. And Jason? Nowhere to be found. One evening, while Laura was cooking dinner, she sighed dramatically, barely looking up as she said, Jason promised Sophie he'd help them find a new place. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. And she believes him? Laura's jaw tightened. He says he's waiting for his finances to stabilize. Right, I muttered. That's what he always says, isn't it? Laura didn't respond. We both knew the truth. Jason wasn't going to help them. He was never going to help them. But Sophie had spent her whole life clinging to the idea of him, choosing to believe in his empty promises, ignoring every sign that he was nothing more than a convenient illusion. And now? She was paying the price. A few days later, Sophie finally reached out to me. Not through Laura. Directly. It was a short message. Dad, I know I hurt you. I know the wedding was a mistake. I don't think I realized how much until it was too late. I just want to talk. Please. I stared at my phone for a long time. A year ago, I would have responded immediately. I would have rushed to make things right, to fix what was broken, to reassure her that nothing she did could ever change how much I loved her. Now, I wasn't sure if I had anything left to give. I didn't reply right away. I let the message sit there, untouched, while I thought about what I wanted. And for the first time in a long time, I realized. I didn't know if I wanted her back in my life. Not because I didn't love her, but because I didn't trust her anymore. I didn't respond to Sophie's message right away. Not because I wanted to hurt her. Not because I wanted to make her wait. But because, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to respond. I had spent 20 years giving, sacrificing, showing up, even when I had nothing left to give. And now, when the dust had settled, when I was no longer needed as a safety net, I had to ask myself a question I had never dared to before. Did I want Sophie in my life? And if I did, on what terms? I agreed to meet her. We chose a park we used to visit when she was little, a neutral space with no history of arguments, just memories of lazy afternoons and scraped knees. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. For a moment, she looked like a kid again. Then she stood up, and I saw the woman she had become, the one who had made choices and now had to live with them. Hey, Dad. The word Dad used to mean everything to me. Now it felt hollow. We sat in silence for a few minutes before she finally spoke. I know I hurt you. Her voice was quiet, uncertain. I didn't mean to make you feel replaced. I didn't answer right away. Then I looked at her, meeting her eyes. But you did. She swallowed hard. Not just at the wedding, I continued. Every time, you ignored everything I did for you. Every time, you chose to see Jason as something he never was. You say you didn't want me to feel replaced, but I don't think I was ever really in that place to begin with. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw regret flicker across her expression. Maybe it was genuine. Maybe it was just another emotion she didn't quite understand yet. I was wrong, she admitted, her voice shaking. I should have chosen you. I should have seen what was right in front of me. And I didn't. I don't know if I can ever fix that, but I just wanted you to know that I do see it now. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to wrap her in a hug and tell her it was okay. But something inside me had changed. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together. As we said our goodbyes, Sophie told me she hoped we could rebuild our relationship. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want it to happen, but because I wasn't sure if it was possible. She had spent years making choices that told me exactly where I stood in her life. And now, she was facing the consequences. The same way I had when she walked down that aisle with another man at her side. Maybe one day, things would be different. Maybe not. But for once, I wasn't the one trying to fix it. I was done chasing people who only remembered me when they needed something. This time, if Sophie wanted me in her life, she was going to have to prove it.